My name is Stefan Klaasen. I'm a senior from West Germany and member of the Student Advisory Committee who has organized this event. Tonight's event is organized by the Projects Committee and the Harvard Political Union, which are both part of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute. And it is also co-sponsored by the Center for International Affairs Student Council. Tonight's discussion is about the changes in Eastern Europe, especially given the recent developments in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. We're trying to understand what the implications of these changes in Eastern Europe will be for those countries, for the other countries of Europe, and for the world at large. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to give a little introduction to the topic we are dealing with tonight. In 1946, Prime Minister Winston Churchill went to speak at a graduation in Fulton, Missouri, and introduced the then famous Iron Curtain term. He said that an Iron Curtain had descended in Europe from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea. What was then first a metaphor for the political and ideological separation which was taking place at that time became then the harsh reality of a wall through Germany, a wall of barbed wire, concrete, and mining fields. The resulting post-war order and the 40 years afterwards were rested on three sets of institutions which are all in question now. The first set of institutions were two states on German soil, separating the Western Bloc from the Eastern Bloc. The second set of institutions were two highly armed military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Peace was maintained by mutually assured destruction and the deployment of Russian and American soldiers in the two Germanys. The third set of institutions created were two economic alliances, the EEC and the Comecon, fostering closer cooperation among the European nations in their respective alliances. Gorbachev's arrival in 1985 has significantly altered the structures in Europe, and it's questioning the survival of these three institutions which have created a lot of stability in Europe for the past 40 years. What started as modest reforms within the Soviet Union in 1985 has turned into a massive reform movement that is in the process of transforming Eastern Europe at a breathtaking speed. Every day we are learning about new events and new changes. What was true yesterday may not be true tomorrow. The question we want to address tonight is in what way these changes are going to affect the institutions created by the post-war system, in what way they're going to affect the people in Eastern Europe, the people in Western Europe, and the alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The first question is Germany going to reunify? And if so, what will its role be in a new European structure? Prime Minister Kohl of West Germany yesterday called for gradual changes towards a confederation of the two Germanys. What does this mean for the EEC? What does this mean for NATO? And what impact is going to have on the post-war structure? The second question is, what will happen to NATO and the Warsaw Pact? Do we still need military systems which hold each other in check through mutual assured destruction? And if not, how will peace and stability be preserved in a new Europe? And the last question is, what will happen to the economic alliances? Will the EEC remain largely a Western alliance of highly industrialized countries? Or will it include Eastern European nations and it will be one big European house, as Gorbachev has suggested some time ago? How will the EEC and the United States, for that matter, deal with the economic restructuring of Europe? Federal Chancellor Kohl wants East Germany to join the EEC. I'm sure if East Germany is going to join, Hungary and Poland might also show interest. These and other questions we're trying to address tonight, and we hope to find some answers. We hope to gain some understanding of what is going on. I first would like to introduce the panelists. Starting here, we have Bill Griffith, Professor of Political Science at MIT, and then I skip over to Professor Joseph Nye, Director of the Center for International Affairs, and in the corner, Shirley Williams, Acting Director of the Institute of Politics. Klaus Christian Kramer is going to speak first. He is a counselor at the Foreign Ministry in Bonn, and here at the moment as a fellow at the Center for International Affairs. He's going to give us the German perspective on the recent developments. Klaus Christian Kramer, please.
Thank you. I would first of all like to emphasize that I am giving a German's perspective on the events. And being a diplomat, I would like to begin with a note of caution. First, it is said that policy planning is nothing but an attempt at replacing coincidence by error. And we're going to prove that tonight. Second, the drama that we are witnessing now has little to do with Germany. My country is just one of several stages of a much greater drama that takes place in Moscow. Nevertheless, the developments in the DDR and Eastern Europe have confronted us again with the question of German unity. That question will be at the center of political debate in Germany for some time. And the discussion will not be made easier by the fact that we are preparing for general elections in a year from now. Yesterday's proposal for further intensification and formalization of the cooperation between the two states is designed to lay a reasonable and rational basis for that discussion and, in a way, to channel it at home and abroad. Cole's concept seeks to combine two goals at the same time: furtherance of German unity and further integration of Europe to a degree that would make the present and divisive predominance of structures of military security superfluous. The repeated references to European integration over the last weeks must not be misinterpreted as a publicity exercise to assuage uneasy neighbors. The two goals of national unity and unity of Europe are both enshrined in our Constitution with equal rank and in the same provision. They complement each other. The goal and policy of national unity have never been unconditional, and there are more conditions than just this particular one. West German policy towards the DDR and Eastern Europe has to operate in a framework that leaves narrow room for maneuver. Cornerstones are the Soviet Union and the US will continue to influence the face of the entire continent, even if and when their relationship were less antagonistic than at present. The four powers' rights and responsibilities with regard to Berlin, Germany as a whole, and the question of German unity. Germany is not master of its own fate. The security system in Europe. NATO is West Germany's lifeline, not only in terms of military security, but also in political terms. And the same is true for the GDR and the Warsaw Pact. And we've got Western European integration. That's vital for Germany, both economically and politically. We have a very solid self-interest in promoting further integration. And then there's another factor. The governments in Eastern Europe we have to deal with are governments in transition. And we do not know what the nations behind them really want, what their future orientation and socio-economic and political development is. We should therefore be very cautious to at the same time talk about self-determination of these nations and draw up grand designs for them or ourselves. In short, there is little room for an independent, autonomous West German response to these events. What is, against this background, then, the so-called German test? It is not a question of size or economic strength. It's a very simple human rights question. Human rights to which all human beings and nations are entitled. And personally, I believe that these civil and economic rights of Germans could best be enjoyed if the one nation were to live in one state that guarantees and protects these rights and whose government and orientation we could freely determine. That is the position our Constitution and the three Western powers have taken and upheld. And that is what we are not going to have for an unforeseeably long time, even if the East Germans should express such a desire, which they haven't done. Why is that so? To cut a sad story short, the Western concept of German unity and that of the Soviet Union are incompatible. The three Western powers have committed themselves to reunification in a treaty concluded with the FRG upon the country's accession to NATO. The two declared they would cooperate with the FRG, and I quote, to reach their common goal, a reunited Germany with a constitution similar to that of the FRG and integrated into the European community. In the last analysis, that amounts to the incorporation of the GDR into the FRG and possibly the Western security system. And that is, as I assume, the vision behind the proposal of Chancellor Kohl. He sees a Germany that looks very much like the FRG. I believe this is unacceptable for the Soviet Union. Soviet interest in the GDR has nothing to do with ideology and little with economy. Even though the GDR is the largest single supplier and buyer, the Soviet Union is in no way dependent, while the GDR clearly is. The GDR's entire and only raison d'etre is to serve Soviet security needs as perceived by the Soviet Union. Beyond the usual contractual obligation of Soviet allies, the GDR is the only country that has enshrined the, I quote, permanent and irrevocable alliance with the Soviet Union in its constitution. The Warsaw Pact and the GDR's membership are vital for both countries, both politically and militarily. And that will continue to be the case at least until the success of the present Polish and Soviet experiment is certain. That is, well into the next century. And that means two things. German unification, or a genuine confederation, continue to be unattainable. All concepts for Central Eastern Europe that touch this Soviet security interest are doomed from the beginning. There is room, then, for political and economic reform within the GDR, which we can and must assist. While I personally think that Chancellor Kohl's proposal is a good idea and should be pursued, I fear that it might still be unacceptable for the Soviet Union, and I'll not enlarge on that. just throw that at you for the discussion. And there is another reason to be careful not to be euphoric at this point in time. Inter-German relations are still very limited and far from being fraternal. That is true in particular in all matters economic. But Germany is the GDR's second biggest trading partner, but intra-German trade is only 12% of the GDR's external trade, which is minimal, and less than 2% of the FRG's. This trade has declined over the years, and the growth potential is small. It is noteworthy that purchases of capital goods from the FRG account for only 16% of the GDR's imports in this field. That is, 84% of these critical supplies come from other and mostly Western sources. There is no direct investment of FRG capital in the GDR at all. So prospects for economic cooperation with the other and even less advanced Commission states must be seen against this background. We therefore do not share the fears or hopes of West Germany becoming a magnet or a dominating factor for the economy of Eastern Europe. Now, all this doesn't sound like the vision thing, but I do think it's realistic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kramer. Now I want to turn over to Shirley Williams. She at the moment is the acting director of the Institute of Politics and at the same time public service professor of electoral politics at the Kennedy School of Government. Previously, she was one of the founding members of the British Social Democratic Party in 1981 and was its president twice in 1982 and then re-elected in 1984. She's going to talk about the implications for the European Economic Community and other economic issues. Shirley Williams.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and may I perhaps begin by congratulating the Student Advisory Committee and the Harvard Political Review for organizing this event, which is such a timely one. Well, let me begin by saying that the picture on the cover of The Economist this week shows a dining room in which a number of people are comfortably seated and eating well, and outside an extraordinary ragtag and bobtail bunch of gatecrashers who are trying to get inside. The dining room is the European community. The people sitting around the table are some of them already quite fat. There's a good deal of food waiting to be eaten, and there's the satisfaction that the dinner is intended to culminate in 1992, when everybody around the dining table will feel that they have had a reasonable share of a bigger pie. The characters outside, the ragtag and bobtail, are wearing all sorts of odd garments. Some of them are wearing kerchiefs, some of them are wearing shawls, some of them are wearing wooden shoes. What's quite clear is that they are a bunch of Eastern Europeans. And they can see the dining room and they think it would be very nice to get in. And The Economist then addresses it to the question of how the people inside the dining room are going to react to the gatecrashers. Well, let me take some of those people very quickly. Herr Kramer's already talked about the Federal Republic of Germany, but I think the Federal Republic of Germany is engaged at the present time in an extremely difficult operation in which at one and the same time it is trying to reaffirm its loyalty and, as it were, total integration into the European community, and on the other side is trying to react to a very powerful political mood, a feeling of celebration and excitement about the sudden arrival of many thousands of East Germans within the country and the evidence that many other thousands of East Germans not yet in the country would like to be close to the Federal Republic. And I think it's an extraordinarily difficult political combination to bring off. I agree with Herr Kramer that I think Herr Kohl is trying very hard to bring it off by talking about a confederation. But as he's already said, the implications for the future of that are extremely complex. If the Federal Republic remains not only a full, but an increasingly integrated member of a European community, that inevitably is going to move on to talk about foreign policy and defence. What is this annex that is still part of the Warsaw Pact going to do in those circumstances? On the other hand, if the East Germans have a purely economic relationship with the European community, then they can never be full members, they can only at best be economic associates. That's question number one. Let's look next at the one other problem about the Federal Republic. 75% of its trade is with the European community and EFTA. Economically, it's already integrated. Very different position than it was in 30, 40 years ago. But it's also true that there are two powerful sets of feelings in the Federal Republic. One of them is a growing concern about the very heavy economic costs that are now falling upon that country. If I may dare say so, it would be impossible for Herr Kohl to get up at the next election in Germany and say, read my lips, no new taxes. Already new taxes are being imposed upon the Germans at the Land level to resettle the East German refugees, and the cost is already huge. For one Land, North Rhine-Westphalia, it's over 5.5 billion marks already, so that one is looking at a vast commitment economically for the Federal Republic. And the rest of us in the West are only too ready to say that the Federal Republic can pick up the largest share of the bill for Poland, the largest share of the bill for Hungary, and maybe anybody else who happens to join the crowd, like Czechoslovakia. We all look to the Federal Republic first. Then there's France. France, I think, is showing clear signs of concern about the possibility of a much larger German confederation being brought within, even economically, the borders of the European community. And the French have reacted, very interestingly, by saying what we have to do is to speed up the process of integration and to extend it from the economic to the political. Last night, the French, together with the other nations concerned, Benelux and the Germans, signed an agreement to remove all frontier controls of any kind, not just economic and trade ones, but every other kind of frontier control, police controls and the like, a major step towards creating a common market within the common market, a tighter, more integrated hub to the European community. The French see the challenge of Eastern Europe as a reason for moving faster towards European political cooperation and as a reason for moving faster towards a confederation of the community. They didn't always think that. That's their reaction now. The British, on the other hand, probably see the Eastern European developments as an argument for a looser structure. It becomes the argument for saying the common European house is one where we should have associations with EFTA, with the Eastern Europeans, with Austria, with all the other countries that are clustering round the community. And so to Mrs. Thatcher, this reinforces her view that one doesn't want to go for a tight, more integrated, hard-driving political community. Personally, I think that this is the wrong thing to do, and I think it's a pity that at this moment Mrs. Thatcher should take that view, because I think this is no time to take that view. But it is her view, and it's clear from the speech at Bruges and her references back to it in the last few days that she's not suddenly going to change, that she may see the Eastern European developments as a reason for slowing down and not speeding up the integration of the community. And interestingly enough, in that, she echoes one of the phrases that Mr. Gorbachev frequently uses, the phrase about the common European house, with incidentally very significant implications for the United States of there being a sort of understanding between the Soviet Union as a European country, because most of it or part of it is, East Europe, which is called Central Europe by them, and Western Europe, which in a sense excludes the United States. The United States, as it were, is on the sidelines in this development. Let me turn from that to just saying a word about the developments in Eastern Europe and what I think they also mean for us. One of the things that Jacques Delors talked about, the President of the Commission, when he was here at Harvard a few weeks ago, was about the concept of more than one model of a democratic structure for the West. And he specifically said that there was not only an American model, but also a European model. And by a European model, he meant a different structure of the welfare state, a different degree of public expenditure, and a different structure of company law, in particular one embracing the concept of Mitbestimmung, or industrial partnership. I think that's interesting, and I think it's important, because I think one of the other great questions we don't know is what way Eastern Europe will want to go. Herr Kramer was right to say that we can't yet see what these societies want, except they want something called democracy. They don't know quite what that means. It combines many things: civil liberties, freedom of speech, shops that are full of goods, material plenty, prosperity, television, much more. We are certain to disappoint their expectations. And the question is how we handle those expectations and how we best give ourselves time to at least begin to achieve some of them. The third point. In those countries in Eastern Europe where there is no obvious organization to carry the basis of a new democratic movement, it's going to be hard going. In Poland, the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was that structure of organization. It wasn't political specifically, but we all know that solidarity was based upon the existence of that organization. In East Germany, the churches played an extremely important part. But as we look at Czechoslovakia, and even more, of course, at the Romanias, the Bulgarias, and so on, it's not clear what the structure is upon which a democratic opposition and then a democratic government will be based. So I conclude by saying this. The real new enemy is not, I think, the old enemies. In fact, one of the great problems of the community is what you do when your enemy goes away. It was Mr. Arbatov who laughed and said, we have deprived the United States of an enemy. But he's also deprived, so far, the European community of a threat. The real danger, I think, could be a slipping into balkanization, into chaos, and into anarchy. And my own view is that the only way one can decisively avoid that is by the community retaining a very tight hub of itself. Around the edge of the community, a series of associations, economic associations with Eastern Europe, and even closer ones with EFTA, that in a sense the community becomes the center of a very wide universe with many associations at different levels of closeness with that universe. And last of all, one word about us. I believe that there is a crucial role for both the community and the United States. Personally, I think we do have to think in terms of some kind of new Marshall Plan over a period of time. I think the immediate bind aid, kind of aid we're giving now, is not going to be enough to see the Eastern Europeans, particularly Poland and Hungary, through to anything resembling a stable economic base. And the only other thing I would say is that, in my view, I think that it's absolutely right that the EC should say that full membership is barred to any country without a fully fledged democracy. But I think it also has to look at associations on the road to that fully fledged democracy in order to make it more likely to happen.
Thank you very much, Shirley Williams. I now turn over to Professor Joseph Nye, who is a Ford Foundation Professor of International Security at Harvard. He's the Director of the Center for Science and International Affairs and a member of the CFIA Executive Committee. Previous positions include the Deputy to the Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance and Chairman of the National Security Council Group on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. He will talk about the impacts of recent developments on the alliance systems, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Professor Nye.
I must say the events of the last few weeks remind me of the anniversary card my wife once sent me. Then you look on the outside of it and it says, you're the answer to my prayers. You open it up and on the inside it says, but you're not exactly what I prayed for. I think many people are very pleased with the events, but they're also a little bit shaken. Pity the poor professor. Think of all those lecture notes for historical studies A12 that have to be rewritten. And in fact, I have a book that's at the printers, and I just got the page proofs back, called Bound to Lead, about the changing nature of American power. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Do I have to rewrite it? Fortunately, not too much. But I think we've all got to the point now where we appreciate the wisdom of Yogi Berra, who said, never make predictions, particularly about the future. I suppose the most dramatic prediction one would make about the NATO and the Warsaw Pact after the events of the last few weeks is that they're at their end. After all, if peace is breaking out, why do you need military alliances? And I'm going to argue that in fact I don't think they're at their end. Though again, I'd be cautious about my predictions. I think they're going to be around for a while. In that sense, I need to justify that argument. Let's start in 1945. At the end of World War II, you had a situation where most countries had been devastated by the war, and there were two that stood out above the rest, the United States and the Soviet Union in their power. And this led to what's been called the bipolar balance of power. Stalin, looking at Eastern Europe, decided that Soviet security would be preserved by imposing social systems on those East European countries, which were replicas of the Soviet social system. And what you found then was a situation where the West saw this as Soviet expansion. There was a great concern. The walls began to go up, not the Berlin Wall until some time later, but as our moderator opened up with, at least the sense of an Iron Curtain. And it led to a rigidification of world politics, though in a very interesting way. The Western Europeans and the Japanese, though physically or geographically very close to the Soviet Union, allied with the United States to balance Soviet power, and that's led to an important stability in the balance of power for quite some time, and that's what may now be coming open for question. So in that sense, we are seeing a period where some of the great tectonic plates of the post-war system are beginning to shift. And in that sense, we are facing something which is very different from anything we've faced in the last 40 years. So how, with that larger perspective, can I justify the proposition that we're likely to still see NATO and the Warsaw Pact around for a while? Well, let me give you a couple of arguments about why I don't think NATO is likely to dissolve very soon. NATO really has two roles. It's sometimes put in the form of a joke that NATO's role is to keep the Russians out and the Germans in. And that really refers to two concerns which worry a number of West European countries. The Russians out, you might say, well, that's not a problem anymore. After all, with Gorbachev's policy and these enormous changes, who's concerned? Well, you can be concerned if you live in Europe and you worry about what happens if something happens to Gorbachev. The French often call this the existential threat from the Soviet Union. Existential in the sense that the Russians exist right there, not very far away. And if you talk to French analysts, they will say, yes, we are very much approving of Gorbachev. Yes, we are delighted with these changes. But whatever would happen to us if the Americans went away and Gorbachev went away too? And then you begin to realize that French policy has changed dramatically. Remember, in the 1960s, it was the French who basically wanted to ease the Americans out, who wanted to get closer to the Soviets. Now you find the French as the leading proponents for Americans staying in Europe. So in that sense, the kind of countries which opposed NATO from the beginning, France in the 60s, have become the leaders of wanting to preserve NATO in the 80s. And that tells you something about one of the two roles of NATO. The other role, which I put jokingly as keeping the Germans in, is something that really goes back to 1870, which is that once Bismarck created a state in the heart of Europe, which was strong enough to defend itself on two fronts at the same time, it was also strong enough to frighten its neighbors on either side when they faced it alone. And in that sense, the problem of how many Germanys there can be in the center of Europe and still have stable politics and no great anxieties is a problem which has plagued the continent and actually led to 3 wars over the last century. What you see is Bismarck's answer was 2 Germanys. He deliberately left Austria out. Hitler's answer was 1 German-speaking state. It was a disaster. And the answer after Hitler's war was, if you want, 3 German-speaking states, East, West, and Austria. And now that is beginning to come open again. But the interesting question is the effects of German unification will depend very much on the context. And here I think that Klaus Kramer was right, that if it's done gradually, if people are reassured if there's a sense that Germany isn't one state trying to thrash about in the center of Europe looking for its own security, making people nervous on both sides of it, then a gradual process of German unification will not be the same as if it is a German unification where everybody is anxious. And the existence of American troops and an American presence in Europe helps provide that reassurance. So I think for both those reasons, the existential threat of the Soviets post-Gorbachev and the question of reassurance during a period as the two German states come closer together, I think those are reasons why there'll be a considerable interest in preserving NATO. Now, what about the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which is less an organization of democratic countries and therefore may be subject to a different type of erosion? The official Soviet policy for some time, as you know, has been that the Soviets would be happy to see German reunification in the context of a Europe without any blocs. So the answer is dissolve the Warsaw Pact, dissolve NATO, and live happily ever after in the common European house. What's interesting about that policy is how quickly it changed the day the wall came down. I happen to, by coincidence, have been scheduled to give a press conference with one of Gorbachev's primary advisors on Eastern European affairs, Georgy Shakhnazarov, on that very day. And what struck me was that he didn't blink for a minute when a reporter asked him, do you care about the East Germans leaving the Warsaw Pact? And the answer is yes, we need the Warsaw Pact. That this essentially this official propaganda position was very quickly reversed, and we've heard it from Gerasimov and other Soviet spokesmen as well. And in that sense, I think there's going to be a strong Soviet reluctance to see the Warsaw Pact dissolved. What they've discovered is that Stalin was wrong, Brezhnev was wrong. You don't have to have the same type of social systems inside neighboring countries to feel secure. But the idea that you don't have any security arrangement with your neighboring countries is something that I think they still feel very anxious about. In addition to that, if you look at the Eastern European countries, there are different feelings about the Warsaw Pact. The Hungarians, who aren't on the main lines of advance in any direction, have a strong inclination toward leaving the pact. But it's interesting if you talk to some Polish analysts to get a different answer. Talking with a Polish analyst of international affairs a few weeks ago, he said the last thing we want to do is leave the Warsaw Pact. It's not because we like the Russians, frankly, we don't. But we also don't like the Germans. And if we notice where we're living today, we're living on a large chunk of what used to be German territory. And we feel about the Warsaw Pact that we'll have it a la carte, which is to say, if the Russians ever attack westward, we won't join. But if the Germans ever decide to put pressure on us toward the east, we just as soon have the Russians with us. So in that sense, different Eastern European countries feel different types of anxieties because of history. And I'm not sure they all want to rush out of the Warsaw Pact quite as fast as some of the statements would lead you to believe. Now, if there is some role then for both NATO and the Warsaw Pact to stay around for a bit, despite the remarkable changes of the last few weeks, what might they do that's useful? It seems to me that within the framework of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, you might see the Warsaw Pact and NATO continuing to organize negotiations on reducing levels of armaments, of creating zones which lead to confidence building and security measures. In other words, a framework for organizing security during a period of great internal turmoil, and thereby providing a sense of reassurance which allows that domestic evolution to progress. I think that might be one part of an answer to the changes that are going on. I do agree, however, very much with what Shirley Williams said. I think a critical part of the answer to stability can't be seen in terms of military alliances alone. The real answer is going to also have to be the strengthening of the European community. It seems to me that 92, but more than 1992, is going to be necessary to create a strong, unified Western Europe, which serves as a magnet drawing countries in the East toward a better economic future. And in those conditions, it's quite plausible to see a security framework that's held in place but gradually becomes less relevant, while an economic framework develops which holds Europe more closely together. So in that sense, I guess if I were to look for an optimistic outcome of the current situation. It wouldn't be one where we immediately abolish the pact and immediately abolish NATO, but one in which we see them holding a framework while the domestic evolution occurs and while the economic strengthening and tying together of Europe goes forward. Now, will that happen or not? I don't know. If events get out of control in Eastern Europe, it may be impossible. If, and one Hungarian expressed to me that the only way to understand what's going on is to think of it as a political Chernobyl, which he said was a meltdown managed by amateurs. So it's quite plausible that events will get out of control. In those circumstances, if Gorbachev or the Soviet Union see the Warsaw Pact falling apart rapidly, they may go back to their old propaganda line, but this time believe it, and say, let's get rid of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. If we're going to lose ours, you might as well lose yours too. I'm not sure that would make us all much more secure. I think it would probably make us less secure. And that is a possibility. Whether it's as likely as the possibility which I sketched for you, I don't know, because I now follow Yogi Berra's advice very closely.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye. Our final speaker is Dr. Bill Griffith, Professor for Political Science at MIT and Adjunct Professor at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. He knows Germany and the German political system very intimately and has spent more than 12 years in Germany in the past. His last assignment was as an advisor to Richard Byrd, the US ambassador to Germany, until 1988. Thank you very much. Dr. Bill Griffith, please.
Events have indeed moved very rapidly in Eastern Europe, and most of all, I think, in the German Democratic Republic. And they certainly pose, more rapidly than most Americans had ever expected, serious problems for American foreign policy. And I'd like to say something about a few of these in the few minutes that I have at my disposal. Basically speaking, it seems to me that American foreign policy toward Eastern Europe in the last 10 or 15 years has been what has been called the policy of differentiation. That is to say that the United States will treat Eastern Europe differently, each country differently, according to two criteria. First, the extent to which they are autonomous or independent from the Soviet Union, and the second, the extent to which they are in the process of liberalization rather than in the process of becoming more repressive. The first and the second are no longer as pressing, I think, to American policy as they were. It is also a fact that this country is 3,000 miles away from Western Europe and even more farther away from Eastern Europe, that Eastern Europe is to most Americans something of what Neville Chamberlain said in 1938 about Czechoslovakia, a faraway country of which we know little. It didn't help him then, and it won't help us now. So the first thing to do about Eastern Europe is to learn something about it. That is not easy, beginning with the fact that they really don't speak English, and that are very many of them, and that only one of them speaks another Western European language, German, and that is the greatest problem of all. So the first thing to do is to learn something about it. And I would recommend that you do so, because I think that the problems of Eastern Europe and of Central Europe and of Europe in general are likely to be with us not only for my lifetime but for yours as well. Secondly, I think that the present American administration seems to me to have a rather mixed record on the subject of Eastern Europe. From the negative point of view, it does seem to me that the President and his advisors were rather slow in understanding how rapidly and how decisively events were moving in Eastern Europe. One must, however, to their credit, say that they probably have a more realistic vision of what might happen in the Soviet Union. Not that it will happen, but that it might happen, than they are fortunately willing to admit publicly. What might happen in the Soviet Union is, I think, far more important than what might happen in Eastern Europe. Because what might happen in Eastern Europe has happened. And it will only be reversed, not because of events in Eastern Europe, and I don't really take too seriously the danger of Balkanization. There is more democratic tradition in Czechoslovakia than there's anywhere east of Switzerland. I think, though, that the administration is correct in thinking that it is unlikely, but unfortunately increasingly possible, that there may be a reversal either of Gorbachev's policy or that he may be overthrown in the Soviet Union. Let me repeat again, I think this is unlikely, but the danger is increasing, and the danger is of economic catastrophe for, as I saw in Moscow 2 weeks ago, the Soviet Union is really an economic basket case. And secondly, the secessionist tendencies in the non-great Russian republics, the Baltic states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, even beginning in the Ukraine, and in, of course, the Soviet eastern provinces. These tendencies are in the process of creating a backlash among the great Russians, which is the principal danger at the present time to Eastern Europe, to Western Europe, and to the peace of the world. I don't think that this will happen, but in this sense I can see why the administration in Washington and why Western European governments think it prudent not to assume that necessarily everything will go as well as it has been going up to now. That having been said, I think that the administration and the Congress have been wiser than they seemed to be at first in terms notably of aid to Poland. I don't suppose it's any secret to those of you who specialize in American politics that this has much more to do with the fact that Chicago is the second largest Polish city in the world than it has to do with Poland. If Senator Simon were not running for re-election, the Democrat from Illinois, next year, I'm not so sure that we would have gotten as much aid for Poland as we did. But then, ethnic assertion, as one can see with the Irish, the Jews, the Poles, and almost everybody else in this America, in this country, except the few who still lay claim to being WASPs, ethnic American pressures are as American as apple pie. And in this instance, they've been very successful, I think, because the United States has, indeed, now anteed up with about $800 million of aid to Poland. The Federal Republic of Germany, on the other hand, has in one way or another anteed up with $2 billion of economic aid to Poland. And it undoubtedly will be much more seriously concerned with and spend much more money on the German Democratic Republic. Leaving aside the question of German reunification, which seems to me not on the agenda in the immediate future, I think that it is extremely important, and there I agree with all the other speakers, that not only the Federal Republic but all the other members of the community be further submerged into it, so that it will become more difficult rather than less difficult for any member thereof, and not only West Germany, to start going off on its own. In this respect, I think that the French, and particularly President Mitterrand, are the most intelligent of the Europeans, and I think that Mrs. Thatcher is an absolute disaster on this subject. And I should say in favor of the administration, having said something in criticism of them, that in his speeches, first at Mainz and then at Leiden in the Netherlands, President Bush did endorse the European community and the intensification of the European community in 1992 with an energy and a decisiveness which I think hardly any American president since Harry Truman has done. I'm not arguing that he foresaw all this, but some of it was happening while he was talking. It is also important to note, on quite another subject, that the president, rather late I think, but still fortunately, realized that it was necessary to come to a compromise with the Federal Republic on the subject of the modernization, so-called, of the short-range Lance missile system. He finally realized, I think, that it was either that or that Chancellor Kohl would fall. And he correctly, I think, decided that it would be better that Chancellor Kohl not fall. This raises, I think, another point which Joe Nye also referred to, I think, and that is that with respect to American policy, it seems to me that intensification of support for the community and its deepening is more than ever required, but that it is important, perhaps even more because America has played the leading role in this, that American policy toward NATO be significantly and rapidly changed. And not only that American forces in Europe should be reduced, they should be reduced, but only if and when there is an agreement in the Conference on Force Reduction in Vienna on this subject, which would mean a major and indeed asymmetrically great Soviet reduction in forces. And there would be then parity at a much lower level. But it is equally important, it seems to me, that the United States not only stop its opposition, which never existed in theory but has usually existed in practice, to the idea of a European second pillar of NATO, to the idea of a European part of NATO, as well as an American and Canadian part of NATO, and that this European part of NATO should be actively supported in its creation by the United States, and that it should probably have a French, but certainly not an American commander. I think that this is the way that Western Europe will be going, and I think that this is something which the United States would be better off if it would take the initiative with, rather than wait around until it gives the appearance of being forced to accept it, which sooner or later, I think, probably will happen. All in all, though, I don't think that the American policy toward Eastern Europe is at present in a particularly bad shape, except for the fact that we're almost bankrupt, which is, after all, not the problem of Eastern Europe. It's the problem of President Johnson fighting the Vietnam War and not wanting to pay for it. And it's even more the problem of President Reagan becoming addicted to that particular variety of moonshine called supply-side economics. But now we have this situation, and we cannot expect, I think, that the American people are going to put more aid to Eastern Europe as a higher priority than reducing the deficit. And indeed, it seems to me that the main priority for this country is and should be to reduce that deficit. Only then will we be able to play the role in the world which will contribute more than we now can to peace and stability. The problem, however, for the United States at the present time in Europe is not Western Europe in its present stage, because we have taken a position, it seems to me, which is highly positive with respect to the intensification of European unity. It is really not even Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe is now practically directed toward democracy, or at least toward a market economy and a multi-party system, with the exception of Romania, which is really almost, it seems, a permanent situation of socialism in one family. And Albania, about which no one seems to care very much. I regret that, because I once wrote a book about Albania. The principal problem for the United States, therefore, is not Western Europe, it is not Eastern Europe, it is the events in the Soviet Union, and particularly the danger of a great Russian backlash against the secessionist minorities. We would be well advised to keep out of this, we will not have much influence on it. What we can do, and what I think that the President has finally come around to see that we should do, is to give what support to Mr. Gorbachev we can, but that is not really going to decide it. What will decide it will be events within the Soviet Union, and on those we can have at best peripheral influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Griffith, who gave us the American view on the events in Eastern Europe. All four panelists have agreed to answer some questions, so if people would like to ask some questions, could please come to the four microphones. There's one over here, one here, and two on the balconies. And please state your name first before you ask the question, and keep your question short, and tell us who you address this question to. So we start over here.
My name is Paul Whitmore, and with the tumult in the power dynamics and the kind of awareness of the marginality of the United States, I was wondering if there's more than a hypothetical role for Japan in the resulting power structure in Eastern Europe.
I was in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke to a deputy foreign minister in Japan about that. The Japanese are mixed in their views of this. They have felt that they've stayed out of these events in the past, and they're a little reluctant to get involved. But the Japanese Foreign Ministry also realizes that with increased Japanese financial power, they're bound to be involved or drawn in. And if you noticed in the last week, there was an announcement of modest, we're talking about $100 or $200 million Japanese assistance to Eastern Europe. So the Japanese are being drawn in gradually. One thing you mentioned was the marginality of the Americans to the process. I don't think the Americans are marginal. I don't think the Americans are going to be able to bail out the situation. But I think what I was trying to argue is that the American role in helping to provide reassurance is far from marginal.
Yes, I'd like to address this to any of the panelists. As an American citizen, if I were to write to my congressman, what should I ask him or her to do?
Well, I'm not, but I think I made it rather plain. I mean, my own feeling is that there ought to be more of a Western response other than the Federal Republic of Germany. I also think it's important for the future that other countries in the West, including Britain, France, and the United States, seem to be involved to a greater extent than they are at present. I think that would help to ease some of the fears about the Federal Republic's role and the Federal Republic's dominance, and I think it would be welcome to the Federal Republic. I fear that the congressman will probably say, no, we can't do it, we're not in an economic position to do it, and I have to give vent to my own view, which is that the United States is at one and the same time the richest country in the world, and the one that, as the professor from MIT said, is nearly bankrupt.
Somebody else want to comment? Okay, you want to take the question?
My name is Ali Mackey, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I have a question to Professor Nye, and this is a different sort of existential question. The nuclear threat is still with us. How can we take advantage of the present situation in Eastern Europe to tie the Soviet Union in binding agreements that would destroy some of these nuclear weapons and make this world a safer place?
I think the climate for arms control and arms reductions in the nuclear area is greatly improved by the Gorbachev reforms. In that sense, the first item on the agenda is to get the current Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty finished. I don't know, some people would say it's three-quarters finished. It's plausible that it could be done by a Washington summit next year. President Bush hinted at that last September. So first step is to move to finish the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. The second step is to realize that many of the short-range nuclear weapons in Europe are probably less important, can be withdrawn. There are already steps to reduce the numbers of short-range nuclear weapons, which are difficult to control. I think there may be increased incentives for that. So I think you may see a period, if the turmoil doesn't get out of hand, we may see a period in which you'll have favorable conditions for nuclear reductions, both at the strategic and the theater level.
Here's a question up in the balcony.
My name's Gabe Sunshine. I'm an undergrad here. Professor Griffiths, you mentioned the danger of Great Russian nationalism. I'm wondering, how real are the threats that sort of after this euphoria passes, that a right-wing irredentist movement will gain force, particularly in Germany and Hungary, seeking to revise the post-World War border settlement?
There would have to be a reinforcement of the guarantee that Germany would not be nuclear, while the Soviet Union, France, and Britain would be. Seems to me an extra guarantee of that. As to Hungary and Romania, there are more than 1 million Hungarians who, as a result of the Treaty of Trianon in 1919, live within Romania. And whatever else you can say about Romania, it is not a pleasant place to live in, and is nowhere nearly as pleasant as Hungary, particularly if you happen to be a Hungarian in Romania. But on the other hand, if one loses wars, and the Hungarians have lost every war they fought in since before the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the fact is that one has to pay for it. I do not think that it is at all likely that any Hungarian government would attempt to invade Romania. And if it tried to, it would certainly soon be set right by its neighbors. In the fact that the head of Romania, Ceausescu, has apparently intimated that he is in the process of producing nuclear weapons is probably no more true than most of his lies, but it would, if anything, further inhibit the Hungarians from such a course, if that were necessary, which it isn't.
Yes, please.
My name is Sidney Topo. I'm a business fellow. It seems to me that the Europeans are going to start to put pressure on COCOM to relax export controls. There is even some indication right now that West Germany wants to provide some telecommunications systems in East Germany, and much of the advanced telecommunications equipment is on export control regulations. Do you see that pressure coming from European countries, and what do you see as the response from the U.S.? Will we still have Richard Pearl who will prevent us from relaxing on these controls?
Let me talk about the first part, and then maybe one of my panel colleagues can talk about the second part. The European community has been unhappy about the COCOM rules for a long time, for two reasons. One, you can dismiss, but they often believe that they are differential in the way they operate. There's lots of complaints about how you come across computers in the Soviet Union, which seem to have come from American sources and yet, can't be sent from Europe. So there's a feeling, rightly or wrongly, of COCOM being, to some extent, a trade diversion process, not just a strategic rule that applies equally to everybody. And secondly, quite honestly, a couple of weeks ago in the Ukraine, I saw all sorts of little computer firms from North America, Canada, Europe, climbing in, trying to sell their wares, and I think we're going to get a good deal of what one might describe as round the edges of COCOM pieces of venture enterprise, which are going to actually weaken the COCOM structure pretty badly anyway. So I would have thought that COCOM needs to be revised and needs to be scaled down to the absolutely essential items. I think its spread is probably too wide to be controlled anymore. But having said that, let me pass over to my American colleagues to deal with what the Americans should do about it.
The Americans, of course, will be split on the issue, as we are split on everything, and certainly while Richard Pearl is not in the government, he will write op-eds for the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. I think the right approach to it is to think of a much narrower list and to think of it in terms of lead times on technologies. With time, technology always spreads, and we shouldn't worry about the spread of technology in general. We should ask about certain very limited technologies which affect, for example, electronic countermeasures in new aircraft and other such things that otherwise cost you a lot in your defense budget. Those are areas where there's still a legitimate role for trying to keep some coordination, much narrower in the past. Now you might say that, yes, but if you do this, then there'll be leakage of great capabilities to the Soviet Union. Well, there's a mixed blessing there. If the Soviets have a lot more computers, and a lot more modems, and a lot more Xeroxes, what better way to reinforce glasnost in case Gorbachev ever were to go? In other words, if you can develop the basis for broad spread communication and democratization of communications in the Soviet Union, it seems to me that's a much better investment in our security than worrying too much about whether you've lost a little bit of 1 or 2 years lead time in the narrowest military sense. So yes, there will be disputes, and some people will say what I said, and others will say what Richard Pearl will say.
Up on the bottom.
It's Ty Thomas. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to go back to the question of territories and address this to Herr Kramer. Has the Federal Republic given up any claims to territories in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Alsace-Lorraine, and France? And second, if there's a confederation between the two German states, would those claims be any different?
I think I can answer very briefly. We do not have any territorial claims against France. And both states in Germany have formally, a couple of decades ago, declared towards Poland and the Soviet Union that they first of all consider the existing borders in Europe as inviolable, and that they will not, now or in the future, claim territory of those countries.
Sarah?
My name is Sarah Sievers. I'm a student at the college, and my question is directed towards Professor Nye. Recently, the Soviet Union has at least implied that Hungary will be allowed to leave the Warsaw Pact if it wishes. Do you see that as an indication of a ploy on the part of Gorbachev, presumably, or an indication that some countries within the Warsaw Pact are more critical security issues than other countries? How do you explain that?
Well, the Soviet statements have never been crystal clear on this, but they have said things about Hungary which are more permissive or more tolerant about leaving the Warsaw Pact than they've said about some of the other countries. I think there's several points there. One is that Hungary is not on the main avenues of military advance. So in that sense, it's much less crucial than East Germany or Poland to Soviet security. The other point is it's an awful lot harder to control the Hungarians. They're further along on this, if you want, process of greater independence. So the costs of actually trying to control the Hungarians, I think, would be very high. And I think the combination of those things has led some Soviets to explore the idea of a Finlandization, or perhaps even an Austrian model, something where Hungary might over time have a status which would be more independent, though not aligned with the West. This, though, as I say, are things you hear from some Soviets. You haven't heard a clear statement at the top saying this is possible or this is recommended. But you do hear from Soviets who you talk to informally about this more exploration of alternatives related to Hungary than with some of the other countries.
This is directed for Professor Nye or anyone else who would like to speak on it. Both the Reagan and I believe the Bush administration have both displayed a reluctance to negotiate strategic nuclear issues, absent settlement of conventional reductions. How does the internal turmoil in Eastern Europe affect Soviet calculations of the need for Soviet security forces in Eastern Europe to maintain security there, or internal order, and how or in which direction will this influence conventional talks? Further, what statements have they made, and to what extent can we believe the revocation of the Brezhnev Doctrine?
Let me give a quick answer, but then also turn to Professor Griffiths. I think the fact that the Soviets have concluded that they don't have to control the internal nature of the governments in Eastern Europe to be secure means the number of troops they have to have in Eastern Europe is greatly diminished. And when you look at the enormous asymmetries that the Soviets are willing to accept in the conventional forces talks, where we cut back, what is it, about 30,000 and they're about 300,000, Bill? I mean, it's a huge difference. I think that indicates that they've decided that you can have security at much lower levels of troops than anybody thought imaginable in the past. And I think that's an interesting sign of progress. In fact, when you talk to some people who are involved in the negotiations on the so-called CFE talks, conventional forces in Europe, they say that every time we put a proposal on the table, the Soviets come in with a counter-proposal that's 1 inch away and deliberately designed to be negotiable. And it's almost impossible not to reach an agreement. So a number of people feel that the Soviets are really moving in a direction to bring this agreement to fruition. But let me ask Professor Griffith to add to that.
Well, I think that is quite true, and that its motives, the motives on the part of the Soviet Union are essentially economic. They are that it simply cannot afford to spend that much money on troops, and it hopes that by spending less money on troops, it can spend more money on perestroika, which at the present time has been an almost complete failure. So that I think that we probably should have some kind of linkage between conventional forces in Europe and the strategic arms talks, but I don't think that it will be decisive, because I think in both instances the Soviet Union will probably come very close to our position.
Do events over just the past few weeks, or have the Soviet Union seemed to be hedging in their calculations at all based on events over the past few weeks?
On the contrary, I would say that the tolerance which the Soviet Union has shown toward events in East Germany and Czechoslovakia would indicate that they are probably more ready rather than less in such fields as conventional and strategic arms control.
We'll have 2 more questions. One over here, please.
Hello, my name is James Lavin, and my question is directed to either of the Europeans on the panel. For years, Americans have complained that the Europeans haven't held up what they believe to be their fair share of the burden of defense, and there seems to be a change in that based on the democratization of Eastern Europe now. We read in the paper today that European leaders have been saying to Bush, don't negotiate troop withdrawals yet. We need the troops there for stability. Do you believe that the current events in Eastern Europe give the American administration some leverage over European governments to pay for some share of the European defense burden?
Well, you've got about 240,000 American troops in West Germany and 160,000 foreign troops from Allied partners in a country, by the way, that is approximately the size of the state of New York plus Pennsylvania. It is a misconception to believe that this is free of any cost for Germany. We are paying for it in not only direct transfers, but in indirect forms such as housing, installations, use of territories for various purposes, and so forth. In this regard, and as a German taxpayer, I do have a feeling that I share my burden for my security. And it is perfectly correct that we have no interest at all in an American troop withdrawal that is not a negotiated one, which would include our participation in those negotiations, of course, and that the presence of these troops is the backbone of the alliance for us. Imagine you didn't have any American soldier in Germany. Then NATO would be largely meaningless for us.
I'd add one line to that. I think that In the case of the Federal Republic, the argument, I think, grows steadily weaker, because if you assume that some of the help that the Federal Republic is given to Eastern Europe is part of an integrated set of Western policies, then there's no doubt that that, combined with what the Federal Republic pays for defense, will bring it up to something quite close to the American level. So I think that much of the argument is probably already washed away by what's happened in the recent months of history. But I guess what will probably happen is that the US defense budget will drop faster than the defense budget of some of the European powers. I would guess that could well happen.
We have a last question over here.
My question is, my name is Bill Griffith. I'm a second year MPA student at Kennedy School. My question is directed to Professor Griffiths. You said, I think I'm not misquoting you, that Eastern Europe is not a problem for the United States and the West, basically because Eastern European countries have been put on the path towards democracy and privatization. I don't think you entirely appreciate the scale of difficulties in Eastern Europe. We are talking about reversing a process which lasted for over 4 decades, and the process of changing infrastructures in these countries is an extraordinary task. There is not a single country in Eastern Europe in which the fundamentals of communist structure have been undermined in a major way. My question is, do you seriously believe that there is a single Eastern European country, and if so, can you give me an example of it, which could succeed in its efforts as far as democratic and economic reforms are concerned, without direct involvement of Western European countries, and especially the United States, by which I mean not throwing money at these countries, but close cooperation, providing expertise, and so on and so forth.
When I said that Eastern Europe was not the primary question for the United States at the present time, I really meant that it was not the primary security question. It is certainly an economic question, and there is no doubt that the United States, and even more Western Europe, should continue to give economic aid, and more than it has done up to now, to these countries. On the other hand, I do not agree with you that there is no country in Eastern Europe where, as you said, the fundamentals of communist control have not been endangered. I think that this is true to a large extent in Poland. It is even more true in Hungary. It probably will be true in East Germany. It probably will be true in Czechoslovakia. And whether or not it is true will not really depend upon Eastern Europe. And that's what I meant. It will depend upon developments in the Soviet Union. I do not think that Gorbachev will have to reverse his policies or be overthrown, but one of the arguments for maintaining American troops in Europe at a reduced level is exactly to guard against the danger that they might be.
Thank you very much. Before we close this debate, I was asked to make three short announcements. First, the German American Forum would like to invite everyone here to a panel discussion tomorrow night, Thursday, at 6 p.m. Litauer room 230, with Kennedy School students who just are returning from a 2-week trip to Berlin, and German students with close ties to Berlin and the GDR. That's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Also tomorrow night at 8 p.m. there is going to be a panel discussion here about the events in China. It's called Tales from Tiananmen Square 2, and there will be students who participated at that time will be speaking tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. The third announcement is those students who signed up to participate in discussion groups afterwards should please ask the ushers or people from the student advisory committee who are holding up their hands right now there to where the discussion groups they have selected will meet. Now I'd like to thank the 4 panelists for joining us tonight. I think it was a very productive evening. Thank you very much.